Hola, I'm Shelly Martinez, and you're watching the Pro Wrestling Top 5.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Pro Wrestling Top 5. Brought to you from the Wrestling Red Carpet. Starring the Showstopper, Shawn Valentino. Also starring Rich Twilling. Today's special guest star, former WWE Diva and TNA Knockout, supermodel Shelly Martinez. This week's episode, the top 5 SummerSlam moments of all time.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Pro Wrestling Top 5. Rich Twilling, Shawn Valentino, your host, and welcome to the Wrestling Red Carpet. Today we're going to review the top 5 SummerSlam moments of all time, given that this is SummerSlam weekend. The event just went down in Brooklyn, New York, and one of the best main events of all time, in my opinion.
Without a doubt.
A four-way. And today we're going to talk about the top 5 SummerSlam moments of all time. Shawn, what's your number 5?
So let's get started. At number 5 on my list, we have two of my favorite performers of all time. You have the wedding between Randy Macho Man Savage and Miss Elizabeth. And I'm sure all of you that are following along with us on our journey with the Pro Wrestling Top 5, hopefully all of you saw our last episode, which was the top 5 Randy Macho Man Savage matches.
If you haven't seen it, go watch it.
So Macho Man is a huge favorite of both of ours, and this was obviously one of his biggest moments of his career. And you have Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, who just got reunited at WrestleMania 7 after Macho Man had his retirement match against the Ultimate Warrior. Savage and Liz reunited after that classic match, which was also one of the greatest moments in WrestleMania history. And I think what's interesting about the Macho Man's career is he has all these magic moments. And if you look back at Macho Man's career, which we have on many of these episodes, and Savage again being one of the biggest icons in WWE, WWF history, you really see how many unbelievably huge moments he had throughout his career. And this is without a doubt one of the biggest, because Savage and Liz are without a doubt the most important wrestling couple of all time. And with Miss Elizabeth, you have arguably the biggest female star in wrestling history, because she was a household name in the late 80s, early 90s. She was basically a childhood crush for an entire generation of young boys, including myself. We loved Miss Elizabeth, and Macho Man Randy Savage was my favorite wrestler of my childhood. So this was a really huge moment, not only for me, but in WWF at the time. And you know this is a monumental occasion, because this is the only time they ended SummerSlam with an angle instead of a match. This was the main event of SummerSlam in 1991. The wedding between Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, and it took place in Madison Square Garden, which Vince McMahon, as we know, loves to have his biggest moments in MSG, and he realized how huge of an occasion this was. And interestingly enough, they were married in real life for years before that, and that's another topic for another show, the relationship between Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth. But it all culminated right here at my number 5 moment, the wedding between Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. Who could ever forget the angle that took place after, in the backstage area, where you have Jake the Snake leaving a snake in one of the gift boxes, which obviously started another huge feud in Savage's career, bringing him back to the ring, which obviously we all knew at the time that he probably wouldn't be retired, because he kind of retired in his prime against the Warriors. So he came back for a feud against Jake the Snake, which also was an epic feud and something that we might recount in a future show. But this entire segment, Macho Man and Liz getting married in front of the grand stage, and then Savage being brought back into the ring because of the angle that took place after the wedding. That's my number 5 moment.
You know, you mentioned the most important couple in the history of WWE. I think people are screaming at us right now saying Triple H and Stephanie. But on camera, that couple, and like you said, they were a married couple in real life, which a lot of people did not know at that time. We knew it, but there were a lot of people that didn't at that time. But anyway, the number 5 on my list is also involving the Macho Man Randy Savage, and that is the very first SummerSlam main event in 1988. The Mega Powers and the Mega Bucks, Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, the two top stars, in the entire company as a tag team. This is when Randy Savage was the WWF champion, and Hogan and him had the program that culminated at WrestleMania 5. But this was summer 1988, and the Mega Bucks, Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant, and basically it was, being that it was the first SummerSlam, they needed stars in their main event. And to me, you can't get any bigger than the 4 of these men at this time. And then of course you had Miss Elizabeth involved, and when she was in the itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini, and it was the first time too that she had shown that much skin, if you will, and she looked amazing that night. Jesse Ventura was a special guest referee. And with this being the first SummerSlam, and you had the Survivor Series and the Rumble that debuted the year before, and WrestleMania was only 4 years old, this was a huge deal to have a pay-per-view of this magnitude and a main event of that magnitude. And again, it was leading toward Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage for the title of WrestleMania 5. So that's why this is number 5 on my list.
Yeah, and again, I mentioned it before, I think Randy Savage versus Hulk Hogan, the Mega Powers Explode storyline, the very best storyline in the history of the WWF, the history of the company. That was just brilliantly done. And I think as Vince McMahon was adding these new pay-per-views to the schedule, he kind of wanted a gimmick with each pay-per-view. Like you had the Survivor Series, Teams of 5, Strive to Survive. You had the Royal Rumble, 30 men competing. And in this, for his first SummerSlam, and I think his original vision for SummerSlam was to conclude each event with a big main event tag team match, because he had that for the first few years in SummerSlam. You had a huge tag team match featuring his biggest stars, and how do you get any bigger than this? You had the 2 biggest baby faces in the company in the champion Macho Man Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan against the 2 biggest heels in the company in the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant. You have Jesse the Body Ventura as the special ref to add more star power. You have superstar Billy Graham and Gorilla Monsoon on commentary. So every one of the core principal characters in this main event is a Hall of Famer, and that just shows how monumental this main event was, and also how important it was in establishing SummerSlam as a brand.
And real quick, we want to, here at the Pro Wrestling Top 5, we want to send our well wishes to the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Get well soon, Rick. And the reason why I brought him up is because it recently came out and it was rumored that Vince McMahon was interested in having Ric Flair in the company main eventing against Randy Savage at the very first SummerSlam. So you mentioned that he does the big tag team matches, and maybe because he didn't have the main event that he originally wanted. If it was supposed to be Savage and Flair, which we did get 4 years later at WrestleMania 8. But that would have been very interesting. So
that would have been monumental, because obviously Ric Flair was the biggest.
Get well, Slick Rick.
Yeah, Nature Boy lives forever. And I'd like to echo Rich's sentiments by giving my best wishes to the Nature Boy Ric Flair and his entire family. One of the greatest of all time, without a doubt. And speaking of the greatest of all time, I'm going to go back to a SummerSlam that both of us were at for my number 4 position, and that was John Cena versus Brock Lesnar for the World Heavyweight Championship at SummerSlam 2014. And this had to be one of the most unique matches in the history of the WWE. We've never seen anything like this, where you have a main event match with John Cena, undoubtedly the biggest star of his generation, getting absolutely squashed and destroyed by Brock Lesnar. And seeing Brock Lesnar demolish John Cena on the grand stage of SummerSlam was almost just a surreal scene.
It really was.
And if you're wondering where the whole phrase Suplex City came from, it started at this match where I think Brock Lesnar suplexed John Cena about like 10, 12 times. It was a very courageous move by the WWE at the time to put John Cena in that position, and it showed that they were really willing to go all the way with Brock Lesnar, because he had just ended Undertaker's streak just a few months prior, and now here he was winning the World Heavyweight Championship in an absolute squash match against the top star of the generation. So again, one of the biggest moments in SummerSlam history. It might have been higher for me, but unfortunately I don't think the follow-up was very good. They kind of ignored the fact that this happened, and the Lesnar title reign at that time didn't really ever take off. I'd argue they're doing a better job with him holding the title right now than they did when he actually beat Undertaker's streak and destroyed John Cena. But either way, you can't take away from that moment. We were both there in the Staples Center in LA, and I think that was a true Hollywood moment for the WWE. That was amazing.
It was definitely unheard of, and something that you would never have expected, especially with John Cena. And a lot of people with professional wrestling, they talk about the lack of realism, and I don't mean the fact that it's predetermined and anything like that. What I mean is, you have your main events, and it's always presented as an athletic contest. But in athletic contests, you have Super Bowls. Not every Super Bowl goes down to the last minute. And so you had this main event where Brock Lesnar just absolutely kicked the shit out of John Cena. And to me, I loved it because, think about it, Brock Lesnar would do that to most people. And so the fact that we saw it, and we saw it live, and the crowd was just stunned. I mean, it was one of those things. It was one of those very surreal moments. And what made number 4 on my list was another very infamous squash match, and that was the Honky Tonk Man defending his Intercontinental Championship as against Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Was scheduled to be in that match. He was hurt. He needed an opponent. He was in the ring, and the man that took the call was the Ultimate Warrior. When his music hit, that place erupted. Yeah, and he came out and he beat the Honky Tonk Man before he could even get out of his jumpsuit. And his record-breaking, to this day, still the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. And it ended in mere seconds with the Ultimate Warrior winning the title from him.
Yeah, and that also took place at the very first SummerSlam. And that showcased that Vince McMahon was really intent on making this a major extravaganza. And right now, SummerSlam is probably the second biggest event that WWE has on their schedule.
It's the third one to me. The Rumble, to me, is always going to be number 2.
Yeah, and so it's arguably in the top 2, top 3. Right. So it's obviously one of the biggest events that they have. And it's because this first SummerSlam showcased some huge moments. And his first 2 moments, as you can see, are from that initial SummerSlam. And just to add to that story, Honky Tonk Man had the longest reign, and he called himself the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time. But he kept his title through very nefarious means. That's what made it such a fun title reign, because he'd get himself disqualified or counted out.
I don't remember him winning a match.
I don't think I even remember him winning a match, and that was a big joke amongst all of us as kids, is that he's got this huge reign, but I don't think he's ever even won a match. But in many ways, I think he was the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time, because he put that title over. He made it seem like it's the most important thing in the world, and he had genuine heel heat. This wasn't a guy that thought it was cool to be, he didn't want to be one of those cool heels. This is a guy that knew his job as a heel was to get booed, and he was the most hated man in the company for a good 2-3 year stretch. And part of the reason for this was his arrogant boasting that he was the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time, when everybody knew that he did not deserve that title.
And when you have a moment like the Ultimate Warrior coming out, surprising everybody and becoming the new champion, it's only that kind of moment because of the guy holding the title. The Honky Tonk Man made that important of a moment because of what he did the years previous to this.
Yeah, and I think that also shows how important it is for the titles to be treated with respect. And which sounds kind of funny, because you had a guy that held the title through nefarious means again for such a long time. But within the context of WWE and the universe they create, it actually did make sense that why not take advantage of the rules that they create? And there's an internal logic to the storytelling, and I think that within the context of that time period, Honky Tonk Man being a heel, and it just created this ultimate moment for the Ultimate Warrior to win the title from him. And the only reason that moment meant so much is because the title was put over, and Honky Tonk Man was over as a major heel. And that's why it didn't make my list, but undoubtedly one of the most unforgettable moments ever as a wrestling fan. And when you watch Ultimate Warrior come in and his music come on, it is amazing. It's probably one of the biggest ovations you'll ever hear as a wrestling fan.
Absolutely.
And speaking of guys that got huge ovations, I don't think there's ever been a wrestler that ever got bigger pops than Stone Cold Steve Austin. And at number 3 on my list is kind of an unusual choice. It's Steve Austin getting his neck broken by Owen Hart by that infamous pile driver that really changed the course of Steve Austin's career, and it changed the course of wrestling history. If you look back at it, Steve Austin was fighting Owen Hart. This is kind of a feud that was transitioned from that epic Bret Hart feud that culminated in WrestleMania 13, which was arguably the greatest match in wrestling history. The unbelievable I Quit match between Bret Hart and Steve Austin, which ironically never ended in I Quit because Steve Austin refused to surrender. And by losing that match, he became the biggest star in the company.
And you also had the double turn.
Yeah, you had the best double turn ever. And the transition feud after that, which a lot of people don't really remember anymore, was him fighting Owen Hart, who was also kind of growing as a star. And I always found Owen Hart to be a very underrated performer. I thought he had kind of a quirky sense of humor and was a really good character, especially as kind of this whiny, weaselly heel that was kind of begging for respect. And I thought that was a perfect match between him and Steve Austin. But unfortunately, this match nearly ended in complete disaster. And I think if you look back at that piledriver spot, and Owen Hart, he didn't do the tombstone piledriver. So go back to the WWE Network and check out this footage of Owen Hart doing this piledriver, because this is not your normal piledriver. And this piledriver has not been seen since then because of this moment where Steve Austin literally broke his neck in the middle of the match. By some miracle, he was able to kind of recover and pin Owen Hart. I mean, it was a very, very awkward
ending. Sloppy roll it, but yeah.
Yeah, it was a very awkward ending. Just the fact that he was able to move is really a minor miracle. And
amazing,
I think he went back and said he couldn't really move, or he doesn't even really remember the ending of this match. But
and the piledriver, if you think the tombstone, so Undertaker and Kane, they go to their knees.
Yeah.
What Owen did was basically a sit-down tombstone.
Yeah, it was like a sit-down tombstone, but it was a jumping sit-down, which made it that much worse because you don't really have that. You don't really have the body control for the person to land properly, and you have to put all your faith in the person delivering the move. And Owen Hart, obviously a veteran, he didn't mean to do it, but
of course,
this is one of those moves.
And
that
Owen Hart, a great worker. Yeah, somebody that obviously knew what he was doing. It's just one of those freak, unfortunate accidents.
This is one of those moves, along with the diving headbutt from the top rope, that just should never be done because there's really no safe way of executing it. But to get to my point, the reason that this is number 3 on my list is after this, Stone Cold had to take a hiatus from wrestling to recover from his broken neck. But during that time, WWF was very creative in really building that Stone Cold character. They gave him a lot of non-wrestling segments, and they really let him develop his promos and really showcase that Stone Cold character, which would go on to become arguably the biggest star in the history of wrestling. And it was because of this moment. Ironically, he gets injured, but he grows as a character. In this one moment where it was a big... And this one moment, which was one of the biggest botches in wrestling history, arguably led to probably the biggest boom in wrestling history with the Attitude Era and Stone Cold Steve Austin becoming the biggest star in the world.
Sometimes some of the biggest moments and stars in professional wrestling are born from things that weren't supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And speaking of Stone Cold Steve Austin, we just want to take a moment to thank him for the El Segundo Brewery's Broken Skull IPA. We enjoy one of these every single time we do one of these broadcasts. So Steve, when it comes to Broken Skull IPAs, we give you a hell yeah.
From broken necks to broken skulls. Let's go on to your number 3.
Let's do it. And you just mentioned Bret the Hitman Hart, and the number 3 on my list is perhaps the best match in the history of SummerSlam, and that is 1992's main event, the Intercontinental Championship match between Davey Boy Smith and Bret the Hitman Hart. And that was the night that Davey Boy became the Intercontinental Champion in Wembley Stadium in front of 80,000 of his countrymen and women, and just a fantastic all-time classic match. You think Ricky Steamboat versus Randy Savage, and I put this, as far as IC title matches, I put this right there with that as one of the absolute best of all time. And Bret Hart losing the title that night actually catapulted him into becoming a main event star. And Davey Boy did not have the big long title run that he thought he was going to have after winning this match. And although Bret Hart lost this match in his championship, he became the star because he ended up becoming a main eventer, and he was WWF champion by WrestleMania the next year. And so one of the best matches I've ever seen between brothers-in-law, and remember Dinah Hart-Smith was involved, and just one of those all-time classic epic matches.
And we just spoke earlier about Stone Cold Steve Austin losing to Bret Hart and becoming a bigger star. This is another example of this here, where you have Bret Hart losing the match to the British Bulldog, but ending up becoming the bigger star as a result. So Sometimes it's not so much about who wins and loses, it's about the match quality, the storytelling in the ring, and the way you portray your character in the ring. And this is a perfect example.
I almost saw this too as kind of a lifetime achievement award for Davey Boy Smith. He'd been with the company for a long time, off and on, and so he got his main event in front of his country, 80,000 people, and he won a championship, a singles championship for the first time in WWE. And to me, that it was kind of that for him. Yeah,
that makes sense. And you might hear more about this match later on in my list. But to go on to number 2 on my list of greatest SummerSlam moments of all time, I'm going to talk about the guy whose career was completely intertwined with Bret the Hitman Hart, for the first half of his career anyway.
Right.
But this guy retired in 1998 with a broken back, but he came back at SummerSlam of 2002, and I'm talking about the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, returning to fight his best friend on the grand stage of SummerSlam 2002, arguably the greatest SummerSlam of all time from top to bottom. But what made it so was Shawn Michaels returning in grand fashion in one of the greatest matches of all time. So during the summer of 2002, Shawn Michaels had actually come back with the NWO, which slowly disintegrated, but eventually they transitioned to a feud with Triple H, who had kind of attacked him in a parking lot. And the whole storyline was designed around Triple H's jealousy of his former mentor and feeling that he had surpassed him.
Right.
And in this amazing match, where Triple H at this time is the bigger star here, and you had Shawn Michaels coming back with his broken back, which nobody really knew the extent of the damage. And at the time, people wondered if Shawn Michaels could even have a match, let alone at the level he had before, which was really, he was the best worker in the company when he had left in 1998. But he came back, I'd argue, better than ever, and this match was a perfect example because it was beautiful storytelling within the context of a match, and this was a street fight. And Michaels comes back, defeats his former best friend, but does it in epic fashion, showing that he's just as good as he was before. He's still the showstopper, he's still the main event, and although this was on the mid-card of SummerSlam 2002, this was the match that everyone remembers, and this showed that Shawn Michaels was still the most show-stealing performer in the world, and he came back to wrestle for another 8 years at the highest level, and you can argue that he had 2 separate Hall of Fame careers with this second half of his career, which is probably better than the first half, and it all started at SummerSlam 2002.
I've argued that exact point before, where between 2002 and 2010, he had a Hall of Fame career on its own, just in those 8 years, and so Shawn Michaels was that good, and you're going to hear about him in a moment. But you said 2002, one of the best SummerSlams of all time. The number 2 best SummerSlam moment on my list is an entire event, and that is SummerSlam 1998. So we're at the height of the Attitude Era here. Stone Cold Steve Austin defending the WWF title against The Undertaker on that card. And that, to me, it was billed as the match of the century, and it really did have that feel to it. And it was one of those matches where you had white-hot Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Undertaker, and you really weren't sure who's going to win that match. A lot of times you go into a main event, you have an idea, but that was definitely a toss-up. Stone Cold went over clean in that match, and it was just one of those really epic feeling events, and one that you have to have at SummerSlam or WrestleMania or something like that. But it was definitely a WrestleMania type main event at SummerSlam, which is basically the WrestleMania of the summer. And also on the undercard of that show, you had a ladder match for the Intercontinental title between Triple H and The Rock. And in that match, you had 2 future Hall of Famers, 2 future WWF champions, and a ladder match for the Intercontinental Championship. So at the height of the Attitude Era, you're showcasing your biggest stars in the biggest event of the summer, and that's why SummerSlam 98 is number 2 on my list.
Yeah, that's a great choice. I don't have that on my list, but I still remember watching SummerSlam 1998 at a friend's house. There was a huge pay-per-view party. There were about 20 or 30 people there, and it kind of had the feeling of watching the Super Bowl, because that was at a time where wrestling was at its absolute height. You had WCW and WWF competing in the Monday Night War, and there was really no time where wrestling was this popular before or since. And wrestling was actually cool in pop culture. Like, everybody was talking about it. People like to think of, Vince McMahon likes to talk about his company as sports entertainment, and there was really no time in the history of WWE that it was bigger on the pop culture entertainment spectrum. And I really loved that main event between Austin and Undertaker, and again, you have that symbolic main event in the middle of the card between The Rock and Triple H, literally rising up the ladder to superstardom. And look at where they are now. You have The Rock as one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and you have Triple H, who's going to be the de facto owner of the company.
Right. And now we made it all the way to our number ones. Sean, make your decision.
So obviously SummerSlam has seen its share of great moments, but for me, number one was an easy choice. And we've already heard Rich talk about this match previously on his list, but I'm going to go with Bret the Hitman Hart versus the British Bulldog in Wembley Stadium at SummerSlam 1992 in front of over 80,000 people. And we already know about the quality of this match. I think if you're watching this list, you've probably already seen it. If you haven't, go watch it as soon as you're done watching this, because it's one of the greatest matches in wrestling history. But not only is it such a great match, it's a very important match, because this match took place during a transition time for the WWF, because they're going through a steroid scandal at the time. And up until this time, Vince McMahon really loved his cartoonish comic book type action hero figures like the Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior. This was the very first WWF Big Four main event that didn't feature Savage, Hogan, or Warrior. So that just shows how much faith Vince McMahon had in Bret the Hitman Hart, who had lobbied for this match at SummerSlam 92. And I don't think you can argue that they earned it, and they really shined. And this took the Hitman star to a whole new level. By the end of the year, he was world champion. I think he defeated Ric Flair to win the world championship a few months later. So this was really a changing of the guard moment for the WWF during a very tough time where they're undergoing a lot of scandal, and people were in doubt of the future of the company and the future of Vince McMahon. He stood a chance of going to jail at the time. So this was really, really a big moment for WWF, and Bret the Hitman Hart and British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith stood up to the challenge, and they really changed the direction of the entire company to go for more of a higher work rate, better matches, smaller wrestlers, and it all started here at SummerSlam 1992, and that's why it's my number one choice.
And as far as my number one goes, you have one of the greatest performers of all time, if not the greatest performer of all time. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and not give you one moment, but a journey, if you will, of Mr. WrestleMania, but in this case, you can call him Mr. SummerSlam as well, Shawn Michaels. And you mentioned 2002, the return match against Triple H, and everything you said there, I echo everything you said. I mean, just a wonderful, fantastic match and storyline. Everything there worked perfectly. And I'm going to go ahead and fast forward 3 years to my second, I guess, Shawn Michaels moment that I loved at SummerSlam, and that was 2005 when he went one-on-one with Hulk Hogan in a match that you never thought you were going to see. Let's face it. If you rewind all the way back to 1998, you had Shawn Michaels on his way out as WWF champion, and Hulk Hogan was still doing his thing in the NWO and WCW. And Hogan came back to the company in 2002, ironically the same year that Shawn Michaels came back, and it was 3 years later at SummerSlam that we had one of the last dream matches. And I think if you think all-time dream matches that we haven't seen, you have Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan, and you have The Rock versus Shawn Michaels. I think those are two that people would love to see. But we actually did get Hogan versus Michaels. And if anybody remembers that match, they remember the fact that Shawn Michaels, he bumped like a machine. And it was, you can say it was almost to the point of, no, it was to the point of where he was mocking Hulk Hogan because he did not want to put him over in this match, but he did. Hulk Hogan won this match, but not before Shawn Michaels became the absolute star of the match. And he's the one guy, both on and off camera, that can get away with doing something like that. Anybody else would have probably been met by The Undertaker at the gorilla position, but just an all-time classic match and classic Shawn Michaels performance. And then fast forward 3 more years to 2008, and what I thought was one of the best non-wrestling angles of all time, and that's when Chris Jericho punched Shawn Michaels' wife in the face. And this took place at SummerSlam. That actually set up their feud in a pay-per-view match a month later. And you mentioned before the Randy Savage marrying Elizabeth at SummerSlam. It's unusual to see an angle at one of the biggest shows to promote a match for later on, but this was so well done, like one of the best non-wrestling moments of all time. And it just shows just how great Shawn Michaels is, and his wife give her the MVP for the night that night because she took a shot from Jericho. And it ended up being one of the best feuds I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years between Jericho and Michaels. The second time they feuded, actually. They faced each other at WrestleMania 19. And this one far superior surpassed that feud, which was also very good. So just a microcosm, 3 moments with Shawn Michaels, but he is number 1 on pretty much any list we could do. I mean, you can put Shawn Michaels at the top of the list.
Career.
This is the Pro Wrestling Top 5. When we do a Shawn Michaels best matches, we might have to change it to a top 10.
Yeah, we might have to do that.
Exactly. Sometimes NBC Sunday Night Football, they'll air on a Thursday or something like that, and they still call it Sunday Night. So it's still going to be the Pro Wrestling Top 5, but when it's Shawn Michaels, we're going to have to
top 10. That might have to be a top 100.
We're going to have to stretch that one out a little bit.
Yeah,
so,
it might take a few weeks to go through that list.
Shawn Michaels, best performer of all time, and he did it at SummerSlam too, not just WrestleMania.
So that's a great choice. Shawn Michaels, the greatest wrestler of all time, in my opinion. And you could really see Shawn Michaels' trajectory of his career develop at SummerSlam from the early days when he was part of the Rockers to his latter days when he was the best wrestler in the world. And just to give a couple comments on what Twilling just said, I was there in the arena for Shawn Michaels versus Hulk Hogan. When you're going to talk about big match atmospheres, that was the definition of a dream match, because everyone in that arena had chills at the time, because these are 2 wrestlers you never really connected and you never really pictured them ever wrestling. But these 2 actually had a very interesting chemistry. They didn't necessarily gel, but you could tell that these 2 really did not like each other, and that just resulted in some riveting television. The promos leading up to this match by Shawn Michaels were some of the greatest in wrestling history. You talk about the face-to-face with Michaels talking down to Hulk Hogan. You have that amazing segment on the Larry King show where Shawn Michaels came in dressed as Hulk Hogan. It was absolutely hilarious.
That was one of my most favorite things I've ever seen on a wrestling show.
Oh, that was just absolutely priceless.
Yes.
If you haven't seen this, go back and check this out. It was incredible. Shawn Michaels as Hulk Hogan on the Larry King show. And probably my favorite of all might have been Shawn Michaels returning to Montreal after all these years and just tearing that crowd to shreds. He was in the center of that ring for about 15 minutes and he absolutely owned the stage. This was the reason why this guy was such a huge star, and this was probably the best promo of his career. Shawn Michaels, Montreal, 2005. Look it up. It was absolutely amazing. So he really carried this feud both in and out of the ring. And although he kind of made a mockery of the match by overselling and doing some really ridiculous bumps, I thought it was hilarious. I remember it was unbelievable. You'll see all kinds of compilations of it on YouTube. It was just classic stuff. But at the same,
the big boot right before the leg drop.
Yeah, where he kind of pops up and just flips around. It was utterly ludicrous.
Fish out of water.
But at the same time, I mean, it kind of fit Hulk Hogan's offense, which is a little bit of a mockery in itself. But in the context of kind of the comic book character that Hulk Hogan is, in his 50s, this was one of the greatest one-man shows in the history of wrestling, with Michaels carrying the movement of an entire match for over 20 minutes with a nearly immobile Hulk Hogan, who actually brought his A-game one last time too, to have one more great match where he took a huge blade job. He did all the classic Hulk Hogan spots all the way to the leg drop. I thought both of these guys just really brought it. But Shawn Michaels, SummerSlam 2005, one of the greatest performances in wrestling history. And speaking of greatest performances, how about SummerSlam 2008, which he just mentioned? I thought this was one of the best angles I had ever seen in wrestling between Shawn Michaels, Chris Jericho, and one of the best feuds ever. This was right up there with the Mega Powers Explode as far as great storytelling, great writing, and I thought they obviously they definitely upped the acting level from what Hogan and Savage were doing back in 1988, because this was a very multi-layered feud with really nuanced emotions. You had Chris Jericho playing the heel, but the best heels, you'd have to argue, are ones that really believe in what they're saying. But you have Chris Jericho, who for once was kind of like a serious character. He had gotten rid of the long hair, put on the suit, and he was playing probably the best incarnation of his career.
It's the best he was ever.
Yeah, he was amazing. Shawn Michaels arguably was the best he ever has been, and obviously, like you said, Rebecca, Shawn Michaels' wife, was just a real pro in taking that punch. This is one of the best angles in wrestling history. SummerSlam 2008. Shawn Michaels, his wife, Rebecca, and Chris Jericho. Great choice at number 1.
Thank you. And there you have it. That's my number 1. You heard his. We want to hear yours. In the comments section below, tell us what your top 5 SummerSlam moments are. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Did we forget something? Let us know in the comments. Make sure to click like and subscribe. And we thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time on the Pro Wrestling Red Carpet.
Thanks for watching. We're desperately out of time.
Thank you for watching the Pro Wrestling Top 5. See you next week on the red carpet.